Good morning and welcome to the March 2019 Pearl Planning webinar. This month, we're going to be talking about the quality of life and your choices in retirement. This isn't necessarily about money. It's about you and what you choose to do with your life. And I'm so pleased today to be here along with Jim Kraft. My name is Melissa Joy, and I'm founder and financial planner at Pearl Planning. And Jim joins me with a wonderful background in thinking about people's lives and careers. And now he's really focused on their thoughts in retirement. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to share, Jim. And this is a great way for me to be able to tell clients about, the possibilities that they do some deep thinking about their own personal life during retirement. So welcome.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, Melissa. Well, let me start off with just a little bit of my background so you kind of can put my experience in the proper context. I've actually had at least three very distinct careers. I started off as a history teacher, spent 13 years teaching history. I have a couple of degrees in history, and then rather magically wound up spending the next 13 years of my career working at Arthur Andersen. And then after I left Arthur, I actually had my own little recruiting and consulting company for a few years before I joined Lyck, who is actually the world's largest career management firm. And about 5 years ago, I began the process of kind of stepping out of the main game and began to retire about 5 years ago and fully stepped out, I guess, about 3 years ago. I actually began the process of thinking about my next phase of life back in 1992 when I was with Arthur Andersen, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is about thinking about how you want the next phase of your life to look. In most cases, people think about the next phase of life as retirement. That's not exactly the terminology that I use. But that'll become clear a little bit later on. My view of life is that there are, about the next phase of life, is there are actually three major issues that people need to consider. Finances are the number one thing that people think about. Whenever anybody starts talking about retirement and considering retirement, the first issue that invariably people are concerned with is, do they have enough money? And of course, that's a very important issue. Melissa is an example of the resources that are available to people, but there's lots of resources out there to help people think about whether or not they have enough money to manage the next phase of life. It's the number one concern that most people will think about. The second issue, and this is increasingly true, is health. Everybody thinks about, most people anyhow, think about maintaining good health as they move into the next phase of life. And again, there are lots of resources out there ranging from doctors to physical therapists to retirement homes to help people manage health as they move into the next phase of life. These two issues are extremely important, but to me, those things I have never really worried too much about. I certainly paid attention to them and spent time thinking about my own personal finances and health. But the thing that always concerned me the most is what was I actually going to do as I moved into the next phase of life? And it's this question of activity that is the subject of today's conversation. Essentially, the question is, what are you going to do when you wake up in the morning? What are you going to do with 20 or 30 years of Saturdays? That's the big question for me, and it's the one that back in 1992, I guess I started worrying about for the first time. Now, as I mentioned, I started thinking about this some 27 years ago, I guess now, and I was at Arthur Andersen. It was a great career, but it really wasn't the career of my passion. And I began to think about, well, what's going to happen next? I can't stay at Lyck or at Arthur Andersen forever. At some point, I'll move on to the next phase. What's that's going to look like? And it's in that period of my life that I began to think about what my life was going to look like and starting to take some planful action about preparing for that. And in that process, I ran across a book written by a guy by the name of Richard Bowles. That book was entitled The Three Boxes of Life. You would know Richard Bowles as the author of a book called What Color is Your Parachute? The book that I read in 1992, The Three Boxes of Life, was very interesting. And as a bit of a historian, I kind of placed this in the context of all of human history. And that is that there are essentially three phases of life for everybody. There is the phase of youth, the development phase, education, as Bowles would have called it, the education box. And that will be in varying lengths. But then once you kind of move out of this youth or development or education box, you move into the adult box. This is kind of the fat period of life. It's the productive phase of life, a career, a house, a family, everything. It's what we think of as the main part of our life. And then after you move out of the productivity phase, the adult phase, you move into the old age box, which is the way Bowles would have described it in 1992 as the retirement box. Now, this is perfectly accurate for the world as it existed in 1992, and it's perfectly accurate for the world that evolved as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that time, the old age box wasn't retirement. It was something more along the lines of decline, dependence, and death. It was very short. People stayed in the productive box as long as they possibly could, and the opportunity to retire simply didn't exist for the vast majority of people prior to the Industrial Revolution. Bowles' view of the three boxes of life, though, is one of the Industrial Revolution. Development, the education box, productivity, the adult phase of life, and then retirement that becomes this kind of R&R, rest and relaxation reward for leading a productive life. And all of that makes perfect sense. This was a model that, again, evolved in the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. It's institutionalized to a certain extent in the United States in 1935 with the passage of the Social Security Act. At that point, kind of officially, the transition from the productive box to the retirement box, from adulthood to old age, became 65. Now, that law was passed and became institutionalized in 1935 at a time when life expectancy was 62. So to a certain extent, the next phase of life, that third phase of life, the retirement box, didn't much matter. Either you weren't going to get to it, or if you did get to it, you weren't going to spend a lot of time in it. But this was the model that was created essentially by my grandparents' generation. It's my parents' generation that lived it, and they passed that model on to my generation as the expectation of what your life was going to look like. The essential model is what I would call the fall off the cliff model. You run around with your hair on fire for 40 years, you come home on evenings and weekends, you do a little bit of R&R time, and then you go back to work on Monday. This is where you generate all of your income, and then you get to be 65, and you essentially fall off the cliff. You stop working, you stop generating income, and the expectation is the balance of your life is going to be this retirement phase that ideally was an R&R period of life, rest and relaxation. Now, I'm not sure this was ever a good model, but it certainly doesn't work today. And the reason is that life is just different. For starters, we live longer. Life expectancy is, I think, statistically around 85. But the fact is, by the time you get to retirement, if you're still alive then, your life expectancy is probably 90, 95. No doubt your financial planning is done with the expectation of living until you're 90 or 95. We're just living longer. That's one issue. The second issue is that as society has evolved, we simply have a different set of expectations than people of prior generations. Frankly, before the baby boomer generation, survival was the main issue for most people in most societies. My grandfather was gassed in the Argonne Forest. Both of my grandfathers were unemployed for 5 years during the Depression. The 20 or 30 guys that were at my mom and dad's wedding in 1944 at camp at an army base in Louisiana. They all died trying to get across the Rhine River in 1945. Now, happily, my dad had already been injured. He didn't go, but life for generations prior to my generation was much more of a struggle, and survival was really a base question. We have moved into a different set of expectations for life. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, essentially, we have moved to a point where many people in life think about what Maslow considered the pinnacle of life's expectations, and that would be self-actualization. The lower levels of Maslow have way more to do with survival. So that's the second issue. We simply expect more out of life than our parents did. Our parents expected survival. We expect self-actualization. And then there is, generally speaking, much greater financial security. Certainly for people on this call, your financial position is probably pretty good. And even though there's a lot of people who have not properly saved or prepared for the next phase of life, society itself is richer. And, you know, we have resources today that prior generations simply didn't have. So these three things, longer life, different set of expectations out of life, and greater financial security, have meant that that old three-box model really is no longer valid. And Bowles started to recognize that around 2000. He and one of his colleagues began writing another book in which they talked about essentially a new box coming in here, stuck in between the productive box and the retirement box. I'm not sure what they called it, quite honestly, and it really isn't a term that has universal acceptance, but we'll call it today the fulfillment box. It's a box of life that kind of comes sliding in after the productive phase, but before the retirement phase. In my view, this is, as you move into this next phase of life, this is the period of life when people will have the greatest opportunity to essentially live life by design. The last time you were close to this, you were 21, young, stupid, and broke. Today, none of those things are true. As you start to move into the next phase of life, you have a lifetime's worth of experiences behind you, you have resources, and you have time. You have the opportunity to live life as fully as you could possibly make it. Up until this point, you have been responsible to your parents, your peers, your boss, the mortgage company, raising the kids. All of those things were obligations. And quite honestly, as you move into the retirement phase, health will start to become a bigger issue. But in this, what we term today, this fulfillment box, this new third box of life, this is an opportunity that we all have for 20, 30 years to really live life by design. So the idea of this particular talk is the question of designing a life that is on purpose, that is going to give you maximum fulfillment. And the new model starts to look like this. Instead of the fall off the cliff model, it is what I would term the long slide. You still have that work phase, that productivity phase. You still will have that retirement phase later in life. But in this fulfillment phase is a period that is going to be much more, well, in fact, the operative phrases, I think, are really these three. First, balance. Balance between personal side of life, the R&R side of life, and the committed phase of life. And by committed aspect of life, I don't mean work necessarily. It could be work, but it could be other forms of committed activity. One of the problems of the old model of retirement, the fall off the cliff model, is that the day after you retire, you wake up in the morning with nothing to do. I think that's a problem. On the other hand, the fall off the cliff model, you had 40 years where you got up every morning and you went to work and you ran around, as I say, with your hair on fire for 40 years. That's not balanced either. Well, the idea of the next phase of life is that it's balanced. You have this balance between the R&R side of life and the committed activity side of life. The second aspect is that it would be varied, multifaceted. Life really is a collection of great opportunities. There's many different ways to live life, many different ways to achieve satisfaction in life. But when you're in kind of the old model, during the work phase of life, the productive phase of life, you're too busy to take advantage of that. As you move into the next phase of life, this is the opportunity to take advantage of all the great variety in life, both from the standpoint of the personal time, the R&R kind of time, but also from the from the committed activity side of life. I wouldn't look at this model as having two things. You've got the R&R side and you've got the committed activity side, but rather the R&R side consists of a variety of things, and the committed activity side could consist of a variety of things. Some of those things may be income generating, some of them may be voluntary activities that, giving back to the community. Some of them may be, I don't know, for example, if you wanted to have a really nice home with a lovely garden, you got to get up in the morning and go take care of those things. That too can be a committed activity. A job could be committed activity. Volunteering at the hospital could be committed activity. And you could have several different aspects of committed activity, and certainly a variety of different aspects of your life in the R&R side. And then the third aspect of the next phase of life is autonomy or independence. Instead of doing things at somebody else's direction, as much as possible, you want to be doing this on your own. So to me, the next phase of life, this fulfillment phase, this new third box, the operative phrases are balance between committed activity and the R&R side, multifaceted, that is, there's a variety of things that you could potentially be involved in, and that you're doing it at your own discretion. Now, what this leads to then is, okay, if I move into the next phase of life, what is it going to look like? The fact is that at any point in life, on any given day, you have three choices of what you are going to do. And these are true, this is true every day. But at certain points of your life where you have important breaks, it becomes especially important to consider this. For example, when you graduate from high school or you graduate from college, when you get married, when you lose a job, when your kids leave the house and they're out on their own, when you retire and begin to move into the next phase of life. Again, these are logical break points, and it's a time for you to consider the choices you have. There are basically three choices. The first choice is what happens most of the time for most people. You continue essentially down the same path you have been on. It's inertia. You do tomorrow what you did today because that's what you did yesterday. Now, when you retire, tomorrow you don't go to work even though you did that yesterday. And what happens with most people when they move into the next phase of life, they move into retirement in the old model, they essentially look to do all day, every day, what they used to do on Saturdays. And that may not be sufficient, but it is an option. And again, this inertia, you kind of continue down more or less the path you've been on, is the way most people wind up leading their lives. You do tomorrow what you did today because that's what you did yesterday. Nothing wrong with that, but it is limiting. The second option is what I would call the dumb luck option. It's where, for one reason or another, you wind up moving down a different path for reasons that were completely unplanned. It's some accidental occurrence. My brother, when he moved into the next phase of life, had never heard of pickleball. But as it turns out, his next door neighbor played pickleball. And one day, at some point fairly early in his retirement, a year or so into it, his neighbor asked him to come play pickleball. Well, now, 6-7 years later, Paul plays pickleball 2 or 3 times a week. There's nothing wrong with pickleball. It's a lot of fun. He enjoys it a lot. But how did he get into that? It was completely accidental. He just happened to be in the driveway when his neighbor was going to play pickleball, and he went with him. It's the random part of life, and there's no way that's ever going to go away. There's always inertia, and there's always going to be dumb luck. But as you move into the next phase of life, this is the great opportunity to live life by design, and so making conscious decisions to move in directions that may, and in fact probably should to some extent, be new directions for you is also on the table. So the third option is to move in a new direction by choice. But here's the problem. More often than not, when people think about this, they think too short term. And the fact is, we all have blinders on. We are limited by our own experience, by our own knowledge. And when you focus on what it is that you would like to do new that would be different, and you focus on the short term, the fact is that all that's probably going to happen is you're going to bang around within the world that you're already familiar with. You might do some variation on that, but essentially you're going to stay within the world you are already familiar with. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is by definition limiting. So one of the things, as you start to think about conscious decision of what you want your life to look like, is to push the bar out far enough that you're not limited by the blinders. And in my view, you push the bar out 10 years. In 10 years, you believe you can be pretty much anywhere. And the fact is, realistically, you can be pretty much anywhere. If you set your mind to it, 10 years gives you enough time to achieve just about anything. I mean, let's be realistic. You're not going to be a quarterback for the Detroit Lions in 10 years. But within that, those kinds of exceptions, 10 years gives you a far enough horizon to start to imagine the realm of the possible. And that's what you need to do. Imagine the realm of the possible. What could my life look like in 10 years? Start to sort that out, and then you come back and decide, what can I do now that will begin moving me down that path? Will you ever get there? I don't know. But at least you're going to start heading down a path towards something that seems very appealing to you. Now, one of the things that I kind of decided years ago is there are essentially two kinds of people in life. There are dots and there are lines. Everybody has a certain radius. That is, you have a certain intellect, you have a certain level of curiosity, you have a certain personality, you have a certain set of contacts, you have a certain knowledge base. Now, it's not that that radius can't get a little bit bigger, but more or less, you have a radius and it doesn't change that much. If you stay in the same place, that radius is going to bring you into contact with pretty much the same thing all the time. Now, clearly, the radius can get a little bigger, and clearly, lightning can strike and cause, and something could pass through your radius that is new and unique. But generally speaking, the dots stay in the same spot. Their radius brings them in contact with the same stuff all the time, and so the world doesn't change very much. A line, on the other hand, by definition, is a series of dots. And as you move down that line, that radius brings you in contact with new things all the time. Instead of, as a dot, that radius creates a circle that stays put. As a line, that radius kind of creates a cylinder that continues moving down this path. What is it that's the difference between a dot and a line? Well, it's essentially movement. What incents the movement? Goals. You move because you're trying to get somewhere. And if you don't have somewhere that you're trying to get to, A, there's no reason to move, and B, even if you wanted to move, you don't know the direction you should move, and so you end up standing still anyhow, even though you would like to move. Now again, the likelihood of you actually achieving the goals or the vision that you've established for yourself isn't really the issue. The issue is movement. The fact is, as you move down a path, invariably you're going to come into contact with things that cause you to redirect. That's perfectly fine. This is very much a dynamic process. it's not really about the destination. Life isn't about the destination. Life is about the journey. I know what the destination is. I know where we're all going to wind up. The question is, what do we do along the way? And having goals and vision that you can start heading towards is what I think creates the excitement in life. So the trick then becomes, how do you create this vision? How do you create the goals that are going to incent action? Now, all of life is essentially performing tasks in some kind of an environment. You can wash dishes in your kitchen. You can wash dishes in a mountain stream in the Adirondacks, or you can wash dishes in a Michelin 3-star restaurant in Paris. The task remains the same, the environment's different. You can be a lawyer and hang out your own shingle. You can be a lawyer and work in corporate America, or you can be a lawyer and work in, a great international law firm. Task and environment. All of life is about doing something and doing it in some kind of an environment. The thing is that up until this point, many of the tasks and the environments you have performed have been directed towards generating income that allows you to support yourself, your family, and prepare, in fact, for the next phase of life. As you move into the next phase of life, the tasks and the environments that you're in obviously should be connected with whatever it is you're going to find personally most fulfilling. But here's the thing. Whenever you perform a task that you enjoy, it's not because you enjoy the task. Every task actually that you perform requires you to use some combination of skills, knowledges, and traits. Essentially, think of Lego blocks. Each skill, each knowledge, each trait you have, you put those things together to perform tasks. Now, you don't use all the skills, knowledges, and traits you have at any given time, and you can reuse those skills, knowledges, and traits to perform lots of different tasks. From a career perspective, the people that hire you are interested in what tasks can you perform and what skills, knowledges, and traits you have. That's how you demonstrate your value in the marketplace for a job. But when you start to think about what do you want your life to look like, two other assets start to come into play here, and those would be interests and values that hiring managers aren't very interested in, nor should they be. They're interested in what tasks can you perform, what skills and knowledges and traits do you have that are going to allow you to perform those tasks. That's what they're interested in. But as you move into the next phase of life, all 5 of these assets become become important. What skills do you have? What knowledges do you have? What personal traits do you have? What interests do you have? And what do you value? Now, the idea then is to figure out what tasks and environments you would be in that would allow you to scratch these assets that are important to you. You see, it's really not about the task you perform. It's about, are you using assets that are important to you? For me, one of the things that's been, I think, helpful to me as I've gone through this path is that since I've been in 2nd grade, I've known what the great interest is for me in life, and that is history. And I've studied history my whole life. I have lots of knowledge in that area. It's very important to me. And so it doesn't really matter what I'm doing related to history. I can be reading books, I can be giving lectures, I can be doing research, I can be writing books, I can be wandering around old historic places. If history's involved, I'm going to enjoy it. That's the way it is with everything. It's not the task you perform, it's what assets are you using. And if you're using assets that are important to you, you're going to enjoy the tasks that you're doing. So the idea is to think about what kinds of tasks could you be, first of all, what are those assets that are important to you? And then what tasks could you perform in what kinds of environments that would allow you essentially to scratch those itches? The idea of developing a vision, a set of goals for the future, is about thinking about what kinds of tasks in what kinds of environments your life should be built around. And the process starts with essentially figuring out what those assets are, prioritizing them, and then doing what one of my clients called creating the wild, bodacious idea of what your life might look like. And that's a really stretched vision of what your life might look like. And then you get practical and create a vision, a written vision of what it is that you would really like your life to look like. And that becomes the goals, the set of goals that you start striving towards. Will you ever get there? Again, I think that's a secondary issue. The vision creates the incentive for movement, and it establishes the direction of that movement. And as you move down that path, the ultimate vision, the ultimate goals will certainly go through change. The key thing is your movement. Uncovering the assets is the first step of the process. There's a variety of ways to do that. But that's the first step really in the process, is thinking about what these assets are that you bring to the table. Some of this can be done simply brainstorming, sitting down with a blank sheet of paper. Some of it using some form of assessments that might help you think about those. But probably the best way is to just think about your own past and the things that in the past you have found rewarding and why those things were rewarding. That will lead you to these individual assets that are particularly important to you. Then what you need to prioritize those things and start to imagine the great, wild, bodacious idea that might allow you to scratch those itches. Ultimately, what you then need to do is to create a practical, written vision statement of what it is that might look like. Typically, if we're talking about a married situation, the couple needs to think about this a little bit differently. There's essentially, the way I would phrase it, yours, mine, and ours. There's my vision. There's my spouse's vision. Those should be more or less, I think, created somewhat independently before you come together to compromise on our vision. I think you want to start this off a little bit separately. Not that you don't talk about this with your spouse, but if you start to get too involved in creating a vision together too soon, you wind up making compromises too soon. Eventually, you're going to need to make compromises, but I think creating your vision, your spouse creating their vision, and then you come together and start to compromise, I think is the better approach. So in the end, the key deliverable would be a vision statement and an associated bucket list. The bucket list is a concept that most people are already familiar with, which is one of the reasons why we use it. It's also relatively easy to develop. It is, however, also fairly superficial. It's kind of a checklist of things that you want to kind of do. And that's important. That's a part of life. But the real life structure is built around this vision statement. And that's the ultimate deliverable of this process. So there we go.
So I wanted Jim to just mention first that the kind of setting the table for why this is important, I hope for many of the people that will have the opportunity to listen to this, is very compelling. Having a more purposeful, meaningful life really matters. But then when you get to the, just write a vision and make your bucket list as well as the, that meaning that goes with it, that might be more challenging, which I think the services that you provide now, where you do both group and one-on-one kind of classes to get to that stage where you do have an achievable vision that is integrated amongst a couple, if so desired, right, is really important and helpful. Could you describe a little bit about your process there?
Yeah, the basic process is essentially thinking about what is it that's important to you. There's lots of books out there about this process, and everybody will talk about developing an understanding of what it is that are your key motivators, the key drivers, what's really important to you. I kind of use the phrase of what are the itches that are important to you? You got to figure out what the itches are. What are those drivers? What are those motivators that are most important to you? And then that's the bottom up part of the process. You got to figure out what those assets are that are important to you. You got to figure out what you bring to the table, prioritize those, and then you flip over to the top down side of this, which is the idea of thinking about what's possible. You can accomplish that in a variety of ways. There's some just kind of brainstorming, mind mapping kinds of activities that you can do. There's plenty of books out there or readings that can give you some ideas of what other people have done. And then there's simply flat out observation in life, looking around at what other people have done, looking for role models, not that you're going to replicate what they do, but they then serve as kind of a catalyst for you to think about how what they do you could modify a bit that would make a great deal of sense for you. You know, one of the things that I've done over the years is my wife and I wind up paying a lot of attention to when we see people doing something really interesting, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to run home and write it onto my computer. Just because it's an example of somebody who is sort of taking control of their life. It's not always people that are in the next phase of life. It could be people that are in the main productive phase of life. But it's the idea of taking control of your life and doing things that are interesting, that people find particularly rewarding. In any event, that's the top-down piece, is kind of imagining what's possible. And then once you've done enough of that, then you have to convert it into the practical vision statement and a practical bucket list. And then those things are essentially pasted on the refrigerator. They're things that you constantly review. I mean, in fact, yesterday, I've just gotten back from vacation, and one of the things that I do at the end of every month, basically, is I have a booklet that I put together that kind of allows me to keep track of the stuff I've done that has been more or less associated with my vision statement. And every month I'll sit down pretty religiously and kind of go through that. What have I been doing that relates to that vision statement that I created really nearly 20 years ago? That vision statement has undergone a lot of change, but it still provides the focus. And I keep track of what I'm doing. And I also revisit that vision statement periodically to rethink, is this really the direction that I want my life to head? And the to-do list or the bucket list is, I mean, that's constantly undergoing review. And the interesting thing is the bucket list, I don't check things off. The bucket list doesn't get smaller, doesn't get shorter, it gets longer. Every time I check something off, I wind up adding 2 or 3 more things. It's kind of interesting.
I think you can open yourself up to possibility.
Yeah.
Where if you're either because of scarcity or lack of capacity, you're really, you know, your head's down, kind of going through life. That iterative association of a visioning process, putting something on the bucket list that really feels unattainable. Once you attain it, it just opens the door to possibilities.
Oh, yeah.
And I've used visioning in business. I know that when the vision gets less clear, then, you know, maybe it's time to do some deep soul searching, but also the extraordinary power to put something on paper that you think you could see 3, 5, 10 years in the future.
Right.
It really puts it out there in the universe, and your actions start to put you on that course. So to bring that concept to retirement, and also have the coursework that you have, or the consultative process where you can make that achievable, because it could easily stay on the to-do list for quite a while if you didn't have someone to kind of guide you through the process, especially when you think of getting 2 people through that process, or a family. I just think that's extraordinary. There's a lot of dovetailing. We did the first 3 webinars of the year were the financials of retirement, thinking about health and longevity in retirement, and then this, and the order matters, right? So, you know, money matters. And when you think about that hierarchy, the more clients I can get to that wisdom level of quality of life in our financial planning conversations, because the other 2 buckets hopefully have been filled up and are being, the attention has been paid. so that we can maintain. It's a really valuable way to integrate and provide a more meaningful life. I think it's important to note too that provides a legacy. You're providing an example to your children about how to live with purpose that will eventually be passed down amongst generations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a concept, I think, that is new to the current generation, but hopefully in future generations, it's simply going to be a part of how they live their life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the boomer generation is literally the first generation with this opportunity. I hope that it will be the standard for generations coming forward.
You know, the other interesting thing to note is on the retirement, when you look at the numbers in retirement, within financial planning and retirement planning, there was an assumption that it would be consumptive. So, you know, you need a certain amount of money on the first day you retire, annualize that, and then give it an inflation boost.
Right.
But people are making an adjustment where their life is more experiential. There's less of a kind of marriage to things. And also, you talked about the phases of life too. You know, there's different stages within retirement itself because it is longer and longer. So there's a lot going on with the work that you're doing and what we're seeing on the other side about how people end up living their life in terms of how the dollars and cents as well.
I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the next phase of life. The old model was, and this is my dad's model, when he retired, there was no way in the world he was going to ever go out and work for an income again. I mean, he told me that when he retired, that he's done working. Well, my dad died at 72, which was statistically perfect for somebody in his generation. You know, retired 65, died 72. He didn't need to work. But one of the things about this next phase of life is that there continues to be income generation, not just possibilities, but things that may be desirable. The things that you do in life that are rewarding for you oftentimes are rewarding to other people as well. You perform tasks that people care about, and you are compensated for those accordingly. It's not that necessarily generating income in the next phase of life is required, but the fact is, by generating income, you're creating opportunities for you to do things that you enjoy. You know, the history stuff, for example, that I mentioned is very important to me. Some of the things I do for history, I get paid for. Not all of it. Some of it's volunteer, some of it's just personal time, but I am compensated for the things that I do that add value in the marketplace. Now, it's nice to have the money. In some cases, people will require that income, but the fact is, because it's valuable in the marketplace, I am compensated for it.
And it's also meaningful to you. It gives back. I think I tell people in their 40s and 50s when perhaps they are able to save and really accumulate in resources so that they can see retirement in the future. I tell them we'd like to get to a point where they can call their own shots. So then they have the opportunity to pursue that, you know, start that business that they've dreamed of, which really isn't about necessarily, in all cases, financial reward. It's about it's maybe a bigger bucket list or a more meaningful bucket list.
Right.
So, or to give back to organizations that really matter in a powerful volunteering or professional capacity. So, you know, the opportunities are endless and they're very personal.
Yes. It's
not something where you can just, you know, take an assessment and then have a game plan. So I think that the work that you're doing is extraordinarily valuable.
Yeah, one of the things about this is this isn't a quick process.
Right.
In my view, this takes a considerable amount of time to understand what it is that's important to you, and then the top-down piece of imagining what's possible. If you rush into this, you're probably going to come up with something that's kind of half-baked. It takes some time. It takes some reiteration. And again, this is never done. It's one of those things that, you know, you're going to continually revisit. And to race to try to get a vision statement, for example, by the end of the month is probably the wrong answer.
Right,
It
right.
just takes time to think this stuff through and to create the realm of the possible.
And I know when I've written my business visions that in some cases it's in my brain for 2 or 3 months where I'm reorganizing, reshuffling, also challenging myself to say, is that all?
Yeah.
You know, are you taking the safe route or the route that really is what you need? So, and then there's that moment where you're ready to start putting pen to paper.
Right.
Sometimes you have to nudge yourself because if it's not happening, maybe, you know, you're making excuses with that process. But
well, the other thing that happens when you do this quickly, I think, without giving it time to gestate properly, you wind up going down paths that you're already familiar with. And it's this tendency towards inertia. You do things, you put together a plan because you're familiar with it.
mm-hmm.
You're familiar with the ideas. Again, there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but it is limiting. And so you need more time to consider a wider range of possibilities. If you do it quickly, I think invariably you wind up focusing on what you're already familiar with.
Right.
Which again isn't necessarily bad, but it's limiting.
Now, when you end up with a vision that really is powerful, with that bucket list, the experiences, or the way that you want to orient yourself, I would encourage folks to bring that back to their financial planner, because many of the things that you mentioned, imagining the realm of the possible, it goes back to the goals within a financial plan.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're getting high quality, high level financial advice, you should be having someone who can work with you then to give you permission if you think, you know, this is what I'd like to do down the road, but not now because I don't have, you know, the resources together, or else give you an action plan. So sometimes I sit down with people and I know we've been able to get to the point where they say what they want, but they don't think they have permission to do it just yet. And there's nothing more fulfilling than saying, no, let's get started on that,
right, because
the money will work out. Or, you know, we've done the calculations, the money's workable. And then if not, then, you know, there needs to be some, there may need to be some plans for financial resources or adjustments with the rest of the plan to make that possible. So that's something to keep in mind, that, you know, it's very powerful when you have professionals working with you to collaborate and to bring the work that you're doing in one sphere
right.
to another. So that you don't shut doors that don't, you know, that really could be open.
Right.
And with that, we're close to the end of our time. So I want to make sure, Jim, that people can contact you looking for your services. Also, you know, from the first time that I met you, it made a lot of sense that there's possibly more opportunities for collaboration. So keep your eyes on our newsletters, because we're hoping we can have an in-person kind of workshop with Jim for people that are at this phase of life sometime in 2019, probably in the second half of the year. So please keep posted there. And you can see both of our contact information, emails and phone numbers on the screen, so to reach out to us and follow up if you would like to. Also, a couple other housekeeping notes, and then I'll let you mention anything you need to mention to kind of wrap it up, Jim. First, thank you for coming and participating in this webinar. For those of you who enjoy our webinars, we have them recorded on YouTube as well, so you can always share them with friends. And you can stay posted on our webinars and other events by visiting our webpage at pearlplan.com, and pearlplan.com/events is where you can find upcoming events. We will be hosting an April webinar, which dovetails with what you mentioned about understanding your values. And we'll be talking about investing with your values and environmental, social, and governance investing, which is very timely given that next month has Earth Day. But I'll let you wrap it up, Jim, with just, you know, a last piece of advice for people as they think about this.
Right. Well, again, I think this is a time-consuming process. Thinking about, I guess one of the best ways to start this is to think back throughout the course of your entire life and go back to when you were 12 years old, of the things that you've done in your life that you found particularly rewarding, and why did you find them rewarding. That's where this all starts. And then the idea of developing a vision of how you're going to scratch those itches is, you know, again, a fairly time-consuming process, but figuring out what it is that's important to you, and then building your life apart on what's important to you. This is the best chance you will ever have to live life by design. Take advantage of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
All right.